Last Sabbath was the seventh day of an 8-day festival that is customarily observed by the Jews, that is not observed by us in the Church of God, because it is not a festival or holy day that is commanded by the Bible. Nevertheless, it is something that is customarily observed by the Jews, and we find reference to Jesus Christ himself taking part in the festivities. In the book of John, chapter 10 and verse 22, we have a reference here in John 10:22 to the fact that it was at Jerusalem, the Feast of Dedication, and it was winter, and Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. This particular festival that the Jews celebrate, which is sort of a combination of Thanksgiving and 4th of July, elements of both that are put together, if we were going to compare it to something with which we're more familiar, it was a national occasion. It was nevertheless observed with great celebration, as it is in the Jewish community today, known as the Feast of Dedication, or the Hebrew name for it is Hanukkah. Now, I know many secular Jews today sort of celebrate it as a pseudo-Christmas, but the reality of it had nothing whatsoever to do with Christmas. There are some interesting things regarding the origin of this occasion. And in the story of the origin of this occasion and the events that came afterward, there are lessons that are certainly applicable for the people of God today, for the Church of God today. And so I want to focus in on some of the things regarding the origin of this particular occasion that was being celebrated in the Jewish community last Sabbath, and to look and to examine what lessons there are that we in the church can derive from the events that constituted the origin of this occasion and from the aftermath of those events. We can go in the beginning back to the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, chapter 8. Now, this occasion, the Feast of Dedication, or the Feast of Lights, or Hanukkah, is not mentioned by name in the Bible. The events that surrounded its origin are not described firsthand in the Bible, but they are described by prophecy, because the events that surrounded this occasion and its inauguration took place about 165 years or so prior to the birth of Jesus Christ. And certainly well over 200 years prior to the beginning of the written record of the New Testament, and also about 200 plus years after the conclusion of the Old Testament record. So it took place during that period that is called the time between the Testaments. The time of which the Bible does not bear a first-hand record in the sense of contemporary accounts, but these events are specifically made reference to in the book of Daniel by way of prophecy. And the events that led up to it are described by way of prophecy, and we're going to see a little bit later on from Matthew 24 that these things have certainly implications for us today that go well beyond the time that was the historic fulfillment at the time of the Maccabees. In Daniel chapter 8, we pick up the story, and this is during the lifetime of Daniel. It is during the time of the last of the Babylonian kings, King Belshazzar. And Daniel saw a vision. And in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 3, in this vision, he saw something rather unusual. He saw a ram that had two horns standing before the river. And these were very high, prominent horns, but one of them was higher than the other. And the higher came up last. So this was sort of an unusual thing. He sees this big ram, and then all of a sudden he sees horns growing out of the ram, and they grow up to be pretty good size, and the one that starts growing last actually outgrows the first one, And so this is an unusual looking ram, but he sees this ram. And the ram pushes to the west and to the north and to the south, and no other creature could stand before it. He just did what he wanted, we're told here in verse 4. And in verse 5, while Daniel was looking at that, he saw a he-goat coming from the west. And this he-goat was moving so fast he wasn't even touching the ground. And he had a notable horn between his eyes. So now here was a very remarkable looking goat. He had one horn, and not just one horn because the other had been broken off, but one horn because that was all he had, and it came up right between his eyes, which was something that was pretty unusual looking. And he came there to the ram that had the two horns, and he ran into it. And he just stomped on that ram until there wasn't anything left. And the ram couldn't stand up to him. He just stamped him into the ground. And then this he-goat, Daniel's here seeing all this in vision, the he-goat waxed very great, and he was strong. And then this big prominent horn that came out from between his eyes was broken off, and out of it came up four little horns, four small horns, four notable ones, and out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, which would be a reference to Egypt, and toward the east, which would be the area of Persia, and toward the pleasant land, which is a reference to Palestine, the land of Israel. And it waxed great, even to the host of heaven, or the people of God. And it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and it stomped on them. And he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, or the leader of these people of God. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of the sanctuary cast down. The host was given over to him, along with the daily sacrifice, by reason of the transgression, and he cast down the truth to the ground. And there was a discussion as to how long these things were going to be, and the daily sacrifice, and stopped, and the transgression's desolation, how long this was going to be. In verse 14, he said unto me that it would be 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, if you'll notice, in my Bible, and perhaps in yours, there's a notation by days, and the marginal rendering is evenings and mornings. This is not the normal Hebrew word for day. What it literally says, unto 2,300 evenings and mornings. You see, the sacrifices were offered every evening and every morning. There were two sacrifices a day offered in the temple, so what we find is the daily sacrifice was to be stopped for a period of 2,300 sacrifices, which would be 2,300 evenings and mornings, or 1,150 days. Now, we don't have to just start guessing as to what all this is talking about, because if we come down to verse 20, we find that the ram that had the two horns were the two kings of Media, the kingdom of Media and Persia. And the rough goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn is its first king. And he being broken, four kingdoms will stand up, none of them having his power. Now, as just a matter of history, the Babylonian Empire of Belshazzar, we're familiar with Belshazzar. He's best known for being the king that saw the handwriting on the wall. You remember the story in the book of Daniel, a very famous story of Belshazzar's great banquet, the handwriting that appeared on the wall. Daniel came in to interpret it, and that very night, the Medes and the Persians entered in. Belshazzar and his group were killed, and the Medes and the Persians took over Babylon. A new empire was set up, the empire of the Medes and the Persians. That is what Daniel describes here in this vision of the great ram with two horns, symbolizing the united empire of the Medes and the Persians. This empire stretched out and pushed out, but it antagonized the Greeks, and ultimately, on down another a period of years later, in fact almost 200 years after the Medes and the Persians had overthrown the Babylonians, about 50 years after they overthrew the Babylonians, they began to push at the Greeks. This brings us to the period of the book of Esther and their attempts to expand their empire to the west. They were never able to successfully do that, though there were some major battles that took place that saw the Persians attempt to overthrow the Greeks. But there was an antagonism that was built up that culminated with the emergence of Alexander the Great, who finally brought together all of the Greek city-states, united them under himself, crossed over into Asia and swept the Persian Empire away. A period of 10 or 12 years, just absolutely conquered the known world, stretching all the way from the area of Greece and what used to be Yugoslavia and some of that area right there on the Adriatic Sea that separates the Balkan Peninsula from Italy. His empire stretched from there all the way to the Indus River in the east, which is right there at the border of India, Pakistan, that area. So he had a vast empire that included modern-day nations like Greece and Turkey and Syria and Lebanon and Israel and Egypt and much of Jordan and Iraq and Iran and portions of Pakistan and Afghanistan and down into the Arabian Peninsula and just a vast empire that he put together, that Middle Eastern area. But his empire only lasted for a very short time because he died. He was cut off as a young man, just into his very early 30s. And his empire divided, and in a period of a very few years after his death, 4 of his leading generals had emerged, each taking a portion of the old empire. And out of one of those, specifically the one that came to be known as the King of the North, there emerged, it talks about this little horn, this individual that came up that we find from Daniel's prophecy entered into conflict with the people of God and ultimately was responsible for causing the daily sacrifice to be stopped, the daily sacrifice to cease, and he also profaned the sanctuary of the temple. And there was a period of time that passed by, just right at 3 years, just over 3 years, about 3 years and 1 month, until the sacrifices were resumed. Now, if we go back to Daniel 11, we notice just a little bit more, again prophetically of the same thing. This is in the first year of Darius the Mede that Daniel saw this vision, and he understood that there would, from verse 2, that there would arise yet 3 more prominent kings in Persia. And the 4th one, or the last one in that sequence, Cyrus the Great was the first. There were 3 more to emerge later, and the last of those would be the one who would provoke the realm of Grecia. This is the last of this sequence here is Xerxes, who is the one who's featured in the book of Esther, stirred up and provoked trouble there. And ultimately, of course, the Greeks, a century or so later, under Alexander the Great, ultimately united, and they evened up the old scores as they came in to attack the Persians. And we find that Alexander was to die in verse 3, in verse 4, that his kingdom was to be broken and divided toward the 4 winds, not to his posterity. And then we find that the rest of Daniel 11 focuses in on 2 of the 4 successors, the Seleucids in the north, which was the area of, let's say, Syria. In what's now the modern nations of Syria and Iraq, was their area, the area anciently called Syria and Babylon. The Seleucus was one of his generals, and he emerged in his dynasty, the Seleucid dynasty, in the north of Jerusalem, and in the south, centered in Egypt, were the Ptolemies, that's spelled with a P, Ptolemy, and he emerged in the south, and these were the two primary ones. And from the biblical standpoint, this is where the focus was, because, of course, Jerusalem was in the middle between the two, and it was a battleground between the two. We go through Daniel 11, a very detailed prophecy, and I'm not going to go through it here. We have in Bible study, and I've given out a chart that sort of takes you verse by verse. It brings you down through, you could find much of this information, historical fulfillment through Daniel 11, and a number of commentaries would bring out some of these things, because it is a very detailed prophecy. But as we come on down here toward the latter part of Daniel 11, we read, speaking here of this individual that is described in verse 21 as a vile person who would obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And we find that he is an individual who comes against the king of the south, against Egypt. And that's described on down to verse 28. In verse 29, he comes back. But this time it's not like it was before, because verse 30 brings out the ships of Kittim, or the Roman fleet based in Cyprus. Kittim was the ancient name for Cyprus in southern Italy. The Roman fleet came against him, and he was not allowed to make his conquest there in Egypt. And we find that he was grieved, and he returned, and that he had indignation against the holy covenant. And he shall return and have intelligence with them that forsook the holy covenant. And arms shall stand on his part, and they'll pollute the sanctuary of strength, and take away the daily sacrifice, and place the abomination that makes desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, and yet they'll fall by the sword, by blame, by captivity, and spoil many days. Now, the description that we have is a man who is known in history as Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a descendant of the Seleucid dynasty in the north. And I want to pick up the story here, reading a little bit of the historical fulfillment. We find that in the book of 1 Maccabees, which is not a part of Scripture, was never intended to be so. It is a historical document that was basically contemporary with this time, and simply records a contemporary witness of the history of what came to be known as the Maccabean period. Because what we find is the story that sets the stage for the New Testament period. And there are some very interesting things from which all of us can and should learn. We find the story here, and I'm going to read you some excerpts out of 1 Maccabees, that talks about the fact that Alexander the Great reigned for 12 years, and then he died. And then we come on down to the point that there came out of them a wicked root, Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes. And we find that he reigned in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. This is figured from the establishment of the Seleucid kingdom in 311 BC, so we would date this at 175 BC. In those days went there out of Israel wicked men, and persuaded many, saying, Let us go and make a covenant with the nations that are round about us, for since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. This device pleased them well. Certain of the people were so forward. They went to the king, and he gave them license to do after the customs of the heathen. They built a place of exercise at Jerusalem, according to the customs of the nations. They made themselves uncircumcised, forsook the holy covenant, joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to do mischief. Now, understand the story. Alexander, one of the great contributions that he considered that he made was an attempt to unify civilization of the world. His was an attempt to provide one world, a one world system, a unity. But the question is, upon what was that unity to be based? The idea of unity is a wonderful thing. The idea of one world is certainly something of which the Scriptures speak. Jesus Christ is going to establish at His return. But you know, the one world that Jesus Christ is going to establish, the one government that He's going to establish at His return, is based upon the law of God and the truth of God. The one world that Alexander sought to establish was not based upon the truth of God. It was based on pagan philosophy. It was based on the Greek language, the Greek culture. It was based using this as a unifying influence that all nations would sort of blend together in their approach. And that Greek language and culture and civilization would be the glue that would hold together all of these diverse peoples. Now there was a problem. The problem centered on the Jews in Jerusalem, the people of God. Because you see, if they were going to keep the commandments of God, if they were going to follow what God said, they weren't going to fit in with that one world that Alexander and his successors attempted to build. Because even when Alexander died and his empire split among the four generals, there was one thing on which all four were agreed, and that was the fact that the Greek language and the Greek culture was the basis by which civilization was to be bound together. Their main disagreement was as to who was to be in charge. They didn't really disagree in terms of the primacy of Greek language and culture and the pagan civilization that this to them represented the culmination of. The main disagreement they had was who was going to be the boss. They all were greedy and they all wanted to sort of divide things up among and between themselves. But Jews were the fly in the ointment as they looked upon it. Because if they were going to follow the religion of the Bible, if they were going to follow the customs that God had laid down in the law, they were not going to fit in with that society, with that civilization that was being attempted to be built. But we find here, Daniel made reference by prophecy of those that were corrupted by flatteries. We find here in the account that Maccabees gave that there were wicked men who went out of Israel and said, look, let's join together with all the rest of them. Let's be like everybody else and just sort of fit in. And so they attempted to do that. They were going to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem. And because it was the customs of the Greeks to exercise in the nude, then they decided that circumcision was going to be a factor because that was going to make them stand out as different, and they wanted to blend in and to be just like the world around them. And so they forsook, we're told by in the account in Maccabees, that they made themselves uncircumcised. They forsook the Holy Covenant. They joined themselves to the heathen and were sold to do mischief. We find, as we come on down through the story, how that after Antiochus had smitten Egypt, he returned and he went again against Israel and Jerusalem. And he entered proudly into the sanctuary, and he took away the golden altar and the candlestick of light and all the vessels thereof and the table of showbread and all of the various ornaments of the temple. He took away the gold and the silver and the hidden treasures. And when he had taken it all away, he went into his land, and having made a very great massacre, and spoke very proudly. Well, a couple of years later, he sent his chief collector of tribute to Jerusalem, and there were more problems and more difficulties. The inhabitants, ultimately, it got so bad that many of the inhabitants of Jerusalem fled, and the city was made a habitation of strangers. The sanctuary was laid waste like a wilderness. And then King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and everyone should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yes, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion and sacrificed unto idols and profaned the Sabbath. And he sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow the strange laws of the land. And he forbade burnt offerings and sacrifices, and commanded that they should profane the Sabbath, pollute the sanctuary. He set up altars and groves, and commanded that they were to leave their children uncircumcised, and that whoever would not do according to the king's commandment would die. Many of the people accepted this. We find many of the people were gathered unto them, to wit, everyone that forsook the law. And so they committed evils in the land. And in the 15th day of the month Keslev, which is the 9th month of the sacred calendar, this is 2 months, therefore, after the beginning of the Feast of Tabernacles, the 15th day of the month Keslev, in the 145th year, which would be 167 B.C., they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and built idol altars throughout all the cities of Judah to every side. Now, evidently, the daily sacrifice itself had been stopped about a month prior to this, and then the abomination, this idol of Jupiter Olympus, was set up. It was from the cessation of the daily sacrifice about a month earlier that represented the beginning of the 1150 days of the book of Daniel, chapter 8. So this abomination was set up. We find that whoever was found with any book of the Testament, or if any consented to the law, God's law, the king's commandment was that they should be put to death. And all sorts of atrocities were performed. And we find that there were many in Israel who were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat any unclean thing. They chose rather to die, that they should not be defiled, and that they might not profane the holy covenant, and so then they died. Now in those days there arose a man by the name of Matthias. He was a priest, and he had 5 sons, and they arose and left Jerusalem and went to a village of Modin. Now, one of these 5 sons was better known than the other 4. He is known as Judas Maccabee, which meant Judas the Hammer. He was an individual who certainly exemplified perseverance, as Mr. Rice spoke of in the sermonette. And he had that hammer-like perseverance that he just kept banging away, and he never stopped. And we're going to notice a little more about him. Matthias and his 5 sons left this area of Jerusalem and went away a short distance to a village, but there was no place to hide. It was just a matter of time till the king's officers came and were going to compel the people to make sacrifice to idols. And they summoned everyone in the village together, and the king's officer summoned Matthias, who was, as an elderly priest, the individual of note in this community. And he summoned Matthias and commanded him to come before the altar and offer a sacrifice to the altar, to the idol. And Matthias answered and spoke with a loud voice, "Though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him and fall away every one from the religion of their fathers and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons and my brethren walk in the covenant of our fathers. God forbid that we should forsake the law and the ordinances. We will not hearken to the king's words to go from our religion either to the right hand or to the left." And when he left speaking these words, one of the Jews came that was willing to sacrifice, because there have always been those who, for what they perceived to be personal advantage, would go along with anything. And when Matthias saw that, it was more than he could bear. He was inflamed with zeal, and his reins trembled, and he ran and slew this man upon the altar. And then the king's commissioner, who compelled men to sacrifice, he killed at that time and tore down the altar. Thus dealt he zealously for the law of God, like as Phinehas. And the story of Phinehas is recorded, of course, in the in the Old Testament. You can read the story back in book of Numbers and Deuteronomy. The story of the Midianites and Balaam and Phineas, who was the grandson of Aaron, that showed zeal to put a stop to that was going on. Matthias exhibited the same sort of zeal as his distant ancestor Phineas. And Matthias, at this point, cried throughout the city with a loud voice, saying, "Whoever is zealous of the law and maintains the covenant, let him follow me." He and his sons fled into the mountains and left all that they ever had in the city. Well, there ensued warfare over a period of the next 3 years. Matthias died, and at the time of his death, we're told that that at the time when Matthias died, he encouraged those who were following him to look to Judas Maccabee as the one to be their captain and to fight the battle. And so the people did. And we find that Judas, called Maccabee, rose up in his stead of his father. This was almost 3 years after these events. And there were several battles that took place, and we find, as we come on down, not going through all the details of the battles, that they took the fortress. Judas and the men that were with him took the fortress there in Jerusalem, and they cleansed the sanctuary. And he chose priests of blameless conduct, such as had pleasure in the law, who cleansed the sanctuary and took away the defiled stones out of the unclean place. And they took whole stones according to the law, built a new altar according to the former, made up the sanctuary and the things that were in the temple, and hallowed the courts, made new holy vessels. And that on the 25th day of the 9th month, the month Keslev, in the 148th year, which was 164 B.C., they rose up in the morning and offered sacrifice according to the law upon the new altar of burnt offerings. And they kept the feast of the dedication of the altar 8 days, and offered burnt offerings with gladness, and sacrificed the sacrifice of deliverance and praise. And Judas and his brethren with the whole congregation ordained that the days of the dedication of the altar would be kept in their season from year to year by the space of 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month Keslev, the 9th month. That is the festival that is mentioned in John chapter 10 and verse 22, the feast of the dedication of the altar, and that represents the rededication of the altar there. Now, there were events that set the stage for this, and all of these events culminated in other things that produced the New Testament world of which we read. Satan has always had two tactics against the people of God, and the entirety of the Bible tells us these two tactics. One is direct frontal assault, an attempt to persecute and to intimidate the people of God, to attack from without. And certainly this was the case. We see that this was the case of Antiochus and others. There have also been other attempts and other things, because Antiochus, one of the things that enabled him to even do some of what he did was the fact that there were those, we are told, who forsook the Holy Covenant. There were those who, there was a contrast. Daniel 11:32 makes it plain. There was a contrast between those who did wickedly against the covenant, who were corrupt by flatteries, and the people that do know their God, who were strong and did exploits. There were those who had an attitude of just sort of going along in order to get along. You know, part of the problems that existed at this point in time came back to a failure of the priesthood to have done the things that it was supposed to do, and certainly and notably with the high priest, because what we find is that there was conflict going back and forth among the members of the priesthood and that many of the leading priests were themselves really enamored of Greek philosophy. They were absorbing all these things. They liked these things. They were trying to curry the favor of Antiochus and the others, and it set the stage for this desolation that came about that resulted in the Maccabee uprising and the ultimate cleansing of the temple. There was, on the one hand, the tactics that Satan has traditionally used, either frontal assault from without or an attempt to subvert from within. And you can go through the Bible from beginning to end and you will find that Satan has always used one or other or a combination of those two tactics against the people of God. And yet we find here, as Daniel alludes to prophetically and as the historical account of Maccabees makes plain, that there were those who had zeal for the truth of God. As Daniel describes them, those who know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Because that ultimately is the key to what is to occur. If it's to occur successfully, that it is strength that comes from God that enables us to do the exploits that will meet with success. Now the Maccabees cleansed the temple. They rededicated the altar. And this, of course, is where this part of the story ends. But it's not really where the story ends, because we're still about 160 years prior to the birth of Jesus Christ. And what we find, of course, is that within a matter of time, the situation again begins to bog down. And ultimately, there are three. The Jewish world becomes filled with bickering party spirit that began to emerge in the aftermath of this. And there were ultimately three parties that developed, of whom we have record in the New Testament. And Jesus Christ had some specific things to say about all three, because they all three represented carnal responses to the problem. The result of the internal bickering and trouble that was going on and the responses of each of these groups set the stage for Roman domination, because ultimately the independence won by the Maccabees was not very long-lived. And within less than under a century, the Romans had become involved in the situation and were declared the area a Roman protectorate. The Romans were going to protect them. When the Romans protected you, the question was really who was going to protect you from the Romans. But this set the stage for the world that we find in the New Testament. A world that was the world into which Jesus came was a Middle Eastern world dominated by the Romans. The Jews were divided among themselves. We find three groups that are described. We find the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians. All three are mentioned in the New Testament. There are other groups that are mentioned in some historical sources, but these are the three on which the New Testament focuses and were the primary ones certainly there in Jerusalem, and the ones that Christ used as an example to teach his own disciples some things. Because when we look in the book of Matthew chapter 16, we pick up the story, and I commented on this during the Days of Unleavened Bread this past time, but we'll note it again here, that the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they evidently made some comment about it, and Jesus said unto them in Matthew 16:6, "Take heed and beware the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees." So Jesus warned them to beware of the leavening of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They, of course, didn't really get the point. They began to argue and reason among themselves about whether why he didn't want them to buy bread from the Pharisees or Sadducees. And he realized what they were doing, and he reprimanded them and told them, look, I'm not worried about where you're going to get bread. Don't you remember the thousands we just fed with a few loaves? Getting bread is the least of the problem. What I'm talking about is, in verse 11, that you should beware of the leavening of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then they realized that he was not talking about the leavening of bread, but the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. He was using physical leavening as a type. As a type. And it was to illustrate the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, if we come on back to Mark chapter 8, Mark chapter 8 and verse 15, we find that he said, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. And then we have the same story that is recounted here. Now, Mark mentions the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Matthew mentions the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of the Sadducees. They each give part of the story. Luke focuses on it a little bit differently. In Luke 12, verse 1, we find that he warned the people, latter part of verse 1 of chapter 12, the book of Luke, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So Christ warned his disciples, and through them, the church, because all of us are the disciples of Christ. And if Christ gave his disciples a warning, it has implication for us today. Christ warned his disciples to beware of three different kinds of leavening, typified by the three parties that dominated the Jewish world during the first century. Three parties that had emerged out of the chaos and the conflict in the aftermath of the Maccabean period. Because you have the story of the Greek world and its attempt, the attempt of the leaders, personified most of all by Antiochus, who sought to impose from without a pagan culture that repudiated the law of God, to impose a pagan culture on the entire world, or the known world, the world over which he ruled. We find that there was collaboration from within the Jewish community. Those who should have been able to be counted upon to stand up for the law of God, many of them didn't. They cratered under pressure. They had an attitude of trying to compromise, trying to go along, trying to blend in, to the point that the very identity of the people of God was threatened. An elderly priest by the name of Matthias was raised up and zealously contended for the law, the culmination of which was the successful overthrow of the Greeks by his son Judas Maccabee, the cleansing of the temple, and the removal of this abomination that had been prophesied in the book of Daniel, chapters 8 and chapters 8 and 11. But that did not provide a permanent solution to the problem. It was an immediate solution. There was a revival. There was an excitement. But there's a lot more that's needed that goes beyond an outward conformity with the law. Ultimately, there emerged three parties in the Jewish community. Out of the strife, the internal bickering that went on, all of the politics and the striving for power that really set the stage as to why the Romans were able to come in and sort of swallow the whole thing up. And they were in charge, ruling that area in the times of Jesus Christ. And he warned his disciples about these three responses that had resulted in the three parties of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians. Now, the Pharisees are perhaps the best known. The Pharisees had an approach. The Pharisees were primarily laymen. They were not priests, as a general rule. The Pharisees were noted for their zeal. They were a people that were zealous, and their zeal, they derived from those whose response to the problems and the influences of pagan society was to utterly separate themselves. And even their very name goes back to a term that meant those that separate themselves. The home of individuals. They were noted for their zeal, but by the time of Jesus Christ, the thing that stands out about the Pharisees, and the thing we normally remember them in a negative sense, because they came to illustrate and to represent those that had substituted outward form in place of the inward substance of religion. Now, there's nothing wrong with form. There's nothing wrong with form, but form without substance is hollow and empty. Form is to give shape and definition to the substance. If I'm going to pour concrete, I'd better set some forms first, or I'm going to have a mess. But if all I do is set the forms and they're never filled with anything, then they're useless. The Pharisees had become so focused upon the outward form that the inward substance was neglected. They sought to erect a hedge about the law and became so enamored of human tradition to protect the law from violation that they thought they lost sight of the intent. Now, the Apostle Paul and others came out of a Pharisaic background. They were noted for their zeal, but some of their zeal was misguided. And many of them settled for a religion that elevated form in place of substance. And their desire to separate themselves from the sins of the nations around became distorted into a holier-than-thou approach, to the point that by the time we read of them in the New Testament, they had an attitude not of humility and of service, but focused upon their own importance, their own holiness and sanctity, and the extent to which they were better than others. The Pharisaic approach, the Pharisaic substitute, the party spirit of the Pharisees is one of the leavens of which Jesus Christ warned His church, because it can spread and corrupt. Christ warned His disciples to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. He also warned them to beware of the leaven of the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees were the priestly class. Nearly exclusively, the Sadducees were the priests. They were the most highly educated. The Sadducees knew the Bible in many ways, but they didn't really have a response of faith. You see, the Sadducees were so leavened with the false intellectualism of the world around. They had absorbed the skeptical approach of the Greek and Roman philosophers. We read in the New Testament that the Sadducees didn't really acknowledge the reality of the spirit realm and of angels, the resurrection from the dead. They didn't really acknowledge that because they were so impressed with the philosophical skepticism of the Greek and Roman philosophers and their educational system. They were filled with that. And their religion was also hollow and empty. Oh, it was intellectual. It was intellectual. Just as the Pharisees thought they were better than everyone else, the Sadducees seemed to think they were smarter than everyone else. Christ didn't have a whole lot good to say about the Sadducees either. Because again, there was a substitute. Oh, they held on to outward forms and trappings of religion, but it was a means that ensured power and status for themselves. But in terms of inward substance, they had really sold out to the hollow, empty intellectualism of the culture around them. The Herodians, on the other hand, were the allies of Herod. Herod was the one whom the Romans installed as king. Herod's claim to the throne was he married the widow of the last of the Maccabees. And through her, sort of wormed his way in and was appointed by the Romans as king. Ultimately, he got rid of her. But he used her as this was his original claim, that he married the widow of the last Maccabee king and had a tried to use that as his claim. Herod and those who followed him had their focus purely and simply on money and power. They were very worldly minded and only practiced enough of the outward form of religion not to just totally scandalize and antagonize everyone else, but in reality their focus was very materialistic, very the immorality and materialism was nothing to hold them back. They looked at things on the basis of what was going to further their own pleasure, their own power, and this was their focus. It was a very worldly, political focus. A focus that, again, placed its emphasis on the material and sensual pleasures and power to be reaped right here, right now. Ultimately, these three party spirits were the ones into which the Jewish community was divided. The solution provided by the Maccabees was not a permanent solution. There were exploits performed, but they weren't a permanent solution to the problem. Jesus Christ came into a world dominated by these three parties, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians, and he didn't join with any of the three. He didn't approve of any of the three, and he warned his disciples, he warned his church to be on guard against those leavens that produced those three party spirits in the people of God anciently, because they would always be the three strains of leaven that would confront the people of God. In Matthew chapter 24, in Matthew chapter 24, Christ's Olivet prophecy, in which he focuses in on the events surrounding his return, he talks about the false prophets, the wars, the rumors of wars, the famines, the disease epidemics. He talks about a time when people will be afflicted and killed in verse 9. And in verse 10, he says, "Many shall be offended and shall betray one another and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall arise and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. He that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. Then shall the end come. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso reads, let him understand, then it's time for those in Judea to flee." Now, when he mentions the abomination that makes desolate, he made it plain that to which he had reference, it was the same one of which Daniel spoke. The events that occurred at the time of the Maccabees was an historical type of the events that would come at the end of the age. He specifically mentions the abomination spoken of by Daniel, the one of which Daniel spoke and prophesied. We've just finished going through some sections in Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 and noticing historical fulfillment in the book of Maccabees of these events. So Jesus Christ warned of some of these things, and He warned of division and of strife. He warned of people becoming offended and hating one another, animosity and resentment, of love growing cold, and iniquity, lawlessness, disregard for God's law multiplying. Some very strong warnings. And warnings that certainly have application to the people of God at all times, but warnings that have special application for the end time generation of God's people. And if this is the end time, which I certainly believe and very strongly believe, and I think most of you do as well, then when we read these words in Matthew 24, and these warnings to the people of God, they ought to have special implication for us. Let's notice, as we go back to the book of Daniel, let's notice some things. In Daniel 11 and verse 31, because in going through Daniel 8 and 11, we primarily focused on the historical aspects and not on the end-time fulfillment, and I don't want to get into all the details of those things now because we don't have time. But let's notice some parallels. Daniel 11, beginning in verse 31. Arms shall stand on his part, and they will pollute the sanctuary of strength, take away the daily sacrifice, place the abomination that makes desolate. Now, Jesus spoke of that in Matthew 24. He said it was the abomination that Daniel had prophesied. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame and by captivity and by spoil many days. That's a thumbnail sketch of the history of the people of God down through the centuries. And when they shall fall, they shall be helped with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flattery. And some of them of understanding shall fall to try them, and to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. That of which Daniel spoke went beyond the historical events of the Maccabees right down to the end time. We find that there will be those who will do wickedly against the covenant and will be corrupted by flattery. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. The key is to know God. Because you see, the key to doing exploits, the key to accomplishing anything of value is to be empowered by God. Apart from the power of God, we can do nothing. The people that do know their God shall be strong. Strength comes through the power of the Spirit of God, and that strength enables us to do exploits. But the key is to know our God. And to know God goes far beyond just knowing about God. It goes far beyond just an academic knowledge of this or that attribute of God. To know God involves walking with God. It involves knowing God. You can only know someone if you spend time with that individual. You know, many of us know about various people, many people in public life. President Bush or President-elect Clinton. Most of us know about those individuals. We've read about them in the newspaper or magazines. We've seen things about them on television. We know certain things about them. Some of what we know may not be true. Some of what we think we know. But we have absorbed a certain amount of information. I don't think there's any of us in this room that can say we know those individuals. We've not spent hours of time with those men, either of those men. You know, the people that you can look around this room and say, I know that person. I know that man. I know that woman. Those are individuals with whom you've spent time listening to them, talking to them, walking with them, and doing things together. The people that do know their God are people who are walking with God. They're close to God. They're spending time in prayer to God. They're talking to God. They're spending time listening to God through the pages of Scripture. And God is an integral part of their day-to-day life. The people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. They're those who are going to do wickedly against the covenant. They'll be corrupt by flattery. People that do know their God will be strong and do exploits. Coming on down to Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. At that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which stands for the children of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as there never was, and there was a nation even to that time. Again, the time of which Jesus spoke, the time of the great tribulation. And at that time your people shall be delivered, every one that's found written in the book. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Daniel doesn't go into the distinction of the time element between the resurrections of which he specifies here. The fact is there will be a resurrection, a time when those who are asleep in the dust of the ground will awaken. There will be those who will wake up in the first resurrection to everlasting life, and there are those who will awaken and ultimately receive shame and everlasting contempt. They that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, the brightness of the sky, just like the sun. They that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. You, O Daniel, shut up the word, seal the book, even to the time of the end. Then you shall run to and fro, and knowledge will be. A time when a resurrection is going, there's a time when a resurrection is going to occur. A time when the wise will shine. Those that turn many to righteousness will shine like the stars. You know, Paul makes reference to that in the book of Colossians, chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, verse 1, If you then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sits on the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above and not on things on the earth. Now, risen with Christ, when we go through the ceremony of baptism, we go through something, an outward form, that is symbolic of a death, burial, and resurrection. And we do so in faith of what that symbolic rising up out of the water reminds us. That of which it reminds us is the fact that we're ultimately going to rise up from the grave. And we are baptized, therefore, in the hope of the dead. The resurrection is the hope of the dead. It is the only hope that the dead have, because the dead are dead. And unless there is a resurrection, the dead have no more hope. We are baptized, immersed, plunged into that water, symbolizing the fact that by one Spirit we're baptized into one body that constitutes all of the people of God from the beginning till the end. And if we're risen with Christ, when we come up out of those waters of baptism, we symbolize the fact that we want the new life that Jesus Christ came to offer. If that's the case, we need to seek the things which are above. Our values, our priorities need to have changed. We need to seek those things which are above, where Christ sits on the right hand of God. And therefore we need to set our affection on things above, not on things on the earth. If you're dead and your life is hid with Christ in God, when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall you also appear with Him in glory. If you're dead and your life is hid with Christ in God, then when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, we're going to appear with Him in glory. We are going to be transformed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. This mortal shall put on immortality. and we will shine forth. Our focus needs to go beyond the right here, the right now. The Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians focused on what was necessary to maintain status and position and power in the world today. Our focus needs to be on what is involved in being a part of the people of God forever. Of realizing that we are crucified with Christ. That if we are dead, we've put to death the old man. Our life is hid with Christ in God. And that if we've been raised up with Christ, we need to seek the things that are above, where Christ is. Looking to that time when the fulfillment of that faith will come. When we were buried in those waters of baptism and raised up to walk in a newness of life, we underwent that ceremony in faith. Faith in the living Jesus Christ, who was raised from the dead, and through the power of God will raise us from the dead, so that when Christ shall appear, we will appear with Him. We will appear with Him in glory. Setting our affection not on the things right here, right now. Setting our priorities not on the carnal responses that resulted in the leavening that produced the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians. But understanding that in the context of adversity and difficulty, in the context of all of the onslaught of Satan's society and Satan's world, that the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And that when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, we shall also appear with Him in glory.